So when it comes to actually playing by ear, one of the worst things that you can do is actually skip intervals. Now, the reason why it's so important to not skip intervals is because if you don't get intervals, you're missing the language of the fretboard. Hey, my name is Jamil Beduinos, and I am the co-founder of FluentInGuitar.com, and I help self-taught guitarists stop relying on tabs and start creating their own personal creative covers by ear. Now, intervals is actually like the missing link when it comes to actually playing by ear that a lot of people miss. So stick around, and I'm actually going to give you my interval ear training map, where I go a little bit more in depth on what I'm going to talk about here today. And yes, it's how the pros think of the fretboard and sound. Look, intervals and understanding the language of the fretboard is one of the most important things ever, okay? When it comes to playing by ear, all right? When it comes to arranging, creating your covers. Why? Because when you're going in and you're trying to figure out a song by ear, you're trying to figure out chords by ear, okay? Which requires for you to understand the language of the fretboard, okay? Meaning you need to understand intervals. Why? Because you're gonna need to be able to figure out the chord by ear, especially in cases where the song is actually taking you further down the fretboard and you need to figure out how to basically put a chord that you built here into over here. But I mean, honestly, it's not just that, because simply just figuring out the chord is going to require intervals, okay, for you to figure it out. Now, when it comes to actually figuring out the full key of the song, intervals is gonna be really, really important. If not, you're not gonna be able to figure out the key of the song. And if we don't figure out the key of the song, well, we're gonna be hunting and picking notes, just being frustrated all the time, and possibly not even end up finishing, because it can get really frustrating having basically all 12 notes to pick from, okay? Trying to figure out which one is the right one. And let's not even think about how harder it will be to actually figure out those chords just by hunting and picking. Absolutely no context, absolutely no help, okay? So that's why it's really important that we get intervals, okay? So what are intervals? Okay, intervals is simply the distance between notes. Okay, so just to show you real quick how this works, all right? For example, we have a G major scale, right? Now, a G major scale, what does it have? It has a tonic, right? And it has the scale, right? Which is the major scale, okay? There's major scale, there's minor scale, okay? So we have the tonic and we have the scale, and that basically forms the key. Now, once we actually get the G major scale, we get a set group of notes, okay? That is going to be used for our song, okay? Or basically that could be used for a song, right? Maybe you have like 7 notes, right? But maybe the song just uses 5 notes, okay? So now that we know, it's like, okay, we have our G major scale, we have our notes, right? But how do we get those notes? How do we come to the conclusion that the G major scale gets 7 notes? Like, what are those notes, okay? So here's where intervals come in. And to be able to figure out these notes, we're gonna use intervals, the distance between notes, okay? Because that's just what intervals are. They're just the distance between notes, okay? So when it comes to, hey, I'm here in my guitar, you know, I'm gonna start in my G note, okay? And I'm gonna use this interval called, I'm gonna use 2 types of intervals. I'm gonna use a whole step and I'm gonna use a half step, okay? A whole step, what is a whole step? A whole step is telling us basically that we're going 2 frets over, okay? So we go from G, we start in G and we go 1, 2, all right? And that right there is an interval, okay? You see, we have basically 2 notes, right? From our G, okay? So that is the distance, all right, between notes right here. 1, 2, okay? That's what it's talking about, all right? That's what it means. So the distance between G and A is 2 notes, okay? We have G, 1, 2, 2 notes, okay? That's all that it is, okay? So we have a whole step. Now for the half step, all that it is, okay, is just 1 note, okay? So if we do from G, if we do a half step, this would be 1 fret over, okay? Meaning the distance between our notes, right? G and G sharp is a half step, it's 1 fret over, right? It's 1, okay? It's 1 note. So that's how it is, all right? Those are intervals. So when we come in and we are figuring out our G major scale, right? We follow a whole step, half step pattern, all right? Which tells us the distance between notes that we need to go over, okay, to figure out the notes of our G major scale. It's that simple, right? So when we go and actually figure out the notes, we would go we start from G, right? Of the notes of G major scale. We start from G, we go whole step. That's an A. We go whole step again. That's a B. We go half step. That's a C. We go whole step again. That's a D. We go whole step again. That's an E. Whole step again. That's an F sharp. And then we go half step again. We go half step. And that's our G again. Okay, we're back to G. So that's how it works. That's how we figure out the notes of our G major scale. Okay? So now when it comes to figuring out chords and stuff like that, like let's say we want to figure out, a triad, right? Which is the simplest form of a chord, right? To figure out a triad, we would need to go down our scale, okay, our G major scale. Let's say we're trying to figure out our G major triad, okay, which is the simplest form of a chord. We would simply just go down the scale and we find the root note, okay, of our G major chord, which is G, okay, which is just the first note, okay. We would find then the third, all right, our major third. That's what the interval note name, is, okay. That's what it's called, but really it's just the third. It's the third note going down the scale, okay. And then we get the fifth note, or perfect fifth. That's the name that it gets as an interval, right? To tell us basically the distance between the notes, okay? Our perfect fifth, right, would basically just be our fifth note going down the scale. So if we figure out a G major triad, we would go, we start on G, right? So G is our first note. It's going to be our root note, okay? So we go G, right? We already have our first note. Now to figure out our second note, okay, we would do, whole step, right? That right there would be our second. We're looking for our third note, okay? So we would have to go another whole step, all right? And right there, we would figure out that that is a B, okay? So we already found G and B, okay? Now we're trying to figure out our fifth note, okay? So our fourth, okay, would be C. It's not C. Then if we go whole step again right here, that would be D, okay? Which would be now our fifth note going down the scale, our G major scale. And there we go. We just figured out G, B, and D. Okay? Like that is our triad. Those notes, G, B, and D, that's what a triad consists of. Okay, so if we go over here, and we try to play it, we have G, B, and D. And that's our G major triad, right? Obviously, like you see right here, the regular major chord. All that this is just basically our three notes, our triad, just repeated multiple times. So right here, we add another G, an open string, then our D, and then we add another D on our open string D, okay? And then we add another G right here on our high E string. All right, you see? And then we add another D, okay, over here in our B string, okay? Third fret. So there we go, right? We just play the full chord. And all these notes are just basically G, B, and D. That is it. You see? So you see how important it is to actually know how to do this, okay? It's really important to know, to understand intervals. And it's just actually super simple, It's super simple because it's just the distance between notes, okay? So when somebody tells you, oh, minor third or major third, they're talking about the distance between notes. In a minor third specifically, they would be talking about 3 half steps. Okay, that would be the distance. In a major third, they will be talking about 4 half steps. Okay, so you see how this works? Okay, so that is basically intervals, low key, just right now in a nutshell. All right, pretty simple, pretty easy. If you want my interval ear map, where I actually basically just lay out what I just talked about here, and I go a little bit more in depth on this, so that intervals don't become your missing link anymore. Okay, when it comes to arranging, creating covers, right? Just drop me a line below, a comment below, and I'll send it to you. Okay, so that is it. All right, thanks for watching, and remember that now is the time to become fluent in guitar. God bless you.